All right. Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Brass, and today we're going to be having a conversation. Um, so, on the bottom, this is John Buck. Say hi to everyone.
Hi to everyone.
All right. And on the top, this is Protestant Prime. All right. So, how are you two doing today?
I'm doing pretty well, thanks. I just got off work and enjoyed some nice fast food.
Mhm. All right.
How, how about you, Protestant?
Oh no, I'm doing good. I just got off work, but I'm enjoying a Coke Zero, the
Very
lunch
nice.
or the lunch of champions.
Very good.
All right. So, before we get started, John, tell the people at home about you.
Sure. I'm at writer John Buck on Twitter. I'm somebody who was raised in a very fundamentalist, sort of non-denominational Protestant household that was very involved with like trying to integrate Christianity with Judaism, and that was how I was raised for a long time until I got to a point of wanting to get a better understanding of Christianity, and so that led to a sort of journey of discovery regarding what was the early church like, and are there any churches that are consistent with what the early church was like. So for about 2 years, I was considering joining an Eastern Orthodox church and was attending church. And I was also going to some Catholic churches as well, because around that same time, I was becoming a fan of the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas. But I eventually realized that I needed to get a fair understanding of what Catholicism is from straight from the horse's mouth, so to say. So I started going to RCIA, and then by the end of it, became Catholic. So here I am.
All right. And what about you, Protestant Prime?
So that's a long story, but to sum it up in the easiest path, I grew up in a very Southern Baptist household. Um, my parents were both very devout Christians. Went to Sunday school, all that. It never really stuck with me. I spent most of my early years as a agnostic. Coming into about the time that about senior year of high school to about freshman year of college, I would have probably described myself as an atheist. I just didn't have any belief until I started, really looking into I caught an interest in philosophy and then started looking into Neoplatonism, and I dabbled in Neoplatonism for a few years. And then out of the blue, I actually started looking into Catholicism just because several of my life events just started pushing me in that direction. So as I was studying Catholicism, I was introduced to Eastern Orthodoxy, and from there I just went that route. Orthodoxy just kind of stole me away,
And
Yeah.
then,
and then I left. Yeah, then about 4 years later, 3 years later, I left Orthodoxy. Mingled around as what I considered myself as just a mere Christian, and eventually, as of last Sunday, actually, my wife and I settled into the Methodist Church. So
oh,
Sweet.
congratulations.
thank you. Not one of the crazy ones that are going on in the Methodist convention right now. It's a good Wesleyan.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. I mean, I was a Methodist once myself. So,
They
yeah.
used to call you Method Man, right?
So, yeah. So, I remember this got on. Originally, this started out as a series of tweets and responses on Twitter between you two. Can you guys give us some, give the audience some context about how that came about?
Prime, you want to do that? Because I actually don't recall.
Yeah, I was actually going back to that right now just to get an idea of
uh,
where all of that came about. Like I was saying, I'm a little underprepared today, so you all have to excuse me. This is my first time doing something like this. So
Oh, that's right. You were like busy, and you were saying like, "Ask me anything," as I
yeah,
recall. And then I asked you, since I knew that you were Eastern Orthodox for a while, but I had known that you had left, but I wasn't sure why. So I asked, like, what led you to leaving the Eastern Orthodox faith?
right.
And then you were like, "That's a long story," but you did go over. Maybe you can go over some of your reasons for why you left. Because I was curious, because having been somebody that was seriously considering Eastern Orthodoxy myself, I actually still kind of see it as like a strong contender for plausible forms of Christianity, such that if I became unconvinced of Catholicism, I would probably do a lot more research into Eastern Orthodoxy and maybe even convert that way.
Right. And yeah, and that's the thing. So I'm going to start out by saying I have nothing against Eastern Orthodoxy. This has no this my movement from it doesn't reflect on the church itself at all. I still recommend, in fact, there's several people I talk to on Twitter. I'm recommending them to head towards it. It's just at the time it was time for me to move on, because a lot of my views that have changed started to conflict with what Eastern Orthodoxy teaches. For
Mm.
example, I'm a leaning Christian physicalist. I've moved to where I no longer believe in this immortal soul, which is a prime foundation for both Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholic teachings.
Mhm.
So, there's a lot of that. And then once again, we both touched on the exclusivity of Eastern Orthodoxy. I mean, even so much so that taking a Catholic Eucharist isn't considered valid within the Eastern Orthodox, and they would
Right.
never provide the Eucharist to the Catholic Church. So it's
Yeah, and even if you're somebody converting from Catholicism into Orthodoxy, they'll have you rebaptized. Like, they
right,
don't consider the original baptism that you had as an adult or even as a child to be valid, which is,
right,
yeah.
exactly, and that's the thing. So I bought in for the longest time. I bought into the whole idea that there's no real salvation outside of the Eastern Church, until I started to meet extraordinarily strong, smart Christians
Mhm.
outside of the Eastern
Mm.
Orthodox Church, and I'm like, maybe God has exceptions for them. And then just as I met more and more, I'm like, okay, so I know that there's Christians outside of the church. So the church shouldn't bind me
Mm.
to this faith. There's something else that binds me to this faith. And so, just as those dogmas started to crumble, I started realizing more and more, okay, well, the ritualism is good. In fact, even Martin Luther loved the ritualism. If you look at a good Lutheran service, there's a lot of ritualism.
Mm.
But especially now, I mean, the Orthodox, they're very big on the sacraments. They're very big on the ascetics, and all of that's good until you start placing those ascetics above your actual relationship, or what you take those rituals and like, oh well, I can do X, Y, and Z because I'm on the journey of salvation, and this Eucharist is gonna
Mm.
bind me back to the vine. And it's one of those things that, just as I started to question it more and more, I'm like, at this point, can I even call myself an Orthodox anymore? I mean, it would be a disservice to myself. It would be a disservice to them. So it was just high time that I move on to the next phase of my life.
Mhm. I
So,
don't want to. Oh,
see-
sorry.
yeah, seeing how you're Catholic, John, have you given your priest your offering, your monetary offering, so to be cleansed of your sins to go to heaven?
Oh, yeah. There's a monthly payment sort of system all set up where I have my check, like my indulgences. I'll just have that listed out under like my weekly, monthly payments to the church. No, no. So, I mean, there's just the general sort of tithing during mass and all that, but that's always voluntary. It's not like they're like, pay up, man, if you want to go through confession, you're gonna have to wet some palms.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, I do sort of get that. I found that interesting how you said you went from being like I would say a more traditional Christian in terms of you became a Christian physicalist.
Yeah.
From because the audience tend to not be very theologically literate, as maybe all three of us are. So can you just give a little bit of a rundown from what that is and what that entails?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, your standard traditional Christian is going to say there is the human body, there's the human soul. The human soul is pretty much the intellect, for lack of a better word. How would you describe the soul as term in the terms of dualism, John?
In terms of dualism, so I'll say that, yeah, most Christians are sort of like neo-Cartesians in that, like, the soul is sort of what you are, this sort of like immaterial sort of the the experiencer or the thinker. Like when I think, that's a faculty of the soul that you have. And I guess the understanding within most Christians is that like God sort of implants a soul into the human body, and then that's just there with the human body throughout its life up until the point in which the body dies, and then the soul goes up to heaven to be with God. Now that's like a typical sort of neo-Cartesian sort of Christian view. As a Catholic, I think the default view is more hylomorphism, which is maybe more integrated, I guess, between the soul and the body, and that like when you look at a body, you're technically like seeing the the soul there, because the soul is what animates that body. It's like you can't even have a body have with a structure and a shape and a form to it unless you have the soul there with it. And so it's I at least see hylomorphism as a better integration between soul and body than most like neo-Cartesian or like full-on Cartesian views of the soul that
Right.
you see a lot of times from Christians.
And so that comes into Christian physicalism, which is more of there is no immaterial soul, it's just physical processes, chemicals fizzing, basically. I'm
Moist
not
robots.
moist robots. Yeah, that's the term that everybody loves to use. Now, I'm not all the way there. I'm in that weird halfway point between holomorphism and Christian physicalism, but
Mm.
everybody that knows me knows that I'm a annihilationist, or I believe in
Right.
the conditional immortality of the soul. I think we have bounds of evidence that shows that the human soul is not inherently immortal, but that's a whole different thing
Mm.
from the actual.
I remember some Christians, I think even some early Jewish thinkers, their view of the soul was more or less that, the human body itself is sort of made with the soul, and what happens is that when you die, nothing really happens, and when it's just like when the resurrection comes and Jesus comes, the second coming comes, and Jesus comes, then everyone just sorts of comes back in their physical body or their renewed body. So it's not like an intermediate period where you're in heaven 1 minute and then you come back down. It's more or less you rise up.
Right. So that's an interesting question then for Prime. Like, would you say that there even is a heaven wherein a disembodied soul could exist prior to the resurrection? Or is it the case that when somebody dies, they're just not going to exist at all up until the point of being given a new body?
So this ties back into, as I exited the Eastern Orthodoxy. So, prior I did believe that, there is at least some type of like intermediary disembodiment in heaven. I've just started to kind of shy away from that view. That's also why I exited, because I mean, once again, if the saints are just in the ground at this point, they're
Mhm.
just in the ground at this point. All the intercession in the world's not going to help me. So yeah, I mean, as of right now, I think I give the idea of soul sleep
Mhm.
a really strong consideration.
I see. Gotcha.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't remember. I know that was a bit of I can't remember his name. I know it's not Inwagon that does that sort of position. I
I
know
think
it's
Van Inwagen is a Christian physicalist of some
Oh
sort.
wait, yeah. Oh wait, I was thinking of Swinburne. That couldn't be
Oh no,
Swinburne.
Swinburne's a hardcore
Oh
duelist.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. In Wagon, I know. Yeah, he's the one that does that. And so that is interesting. So I was wondering, would you make of, like, say, passages where Jesus was saying, well, like he sees Moses like in a sort of heaven.
Well, like, what are you referring to?
Um, I'm trying. I think it was more. I can't remember exactly how it was, but I believe it was something about how.
Would it be like the Transfiguration, where like both Moses and Elijah were there with Jesus up at the top of the mountain? Is it Mount Tabor?
It was Mount Tabor.
Okay, yeah.
I think that's what it is.
And I haven't. That's actually a good question. I haven't really considered that.
Ha,
I
gotcha.
mean, I would assume that God, if he wanted to make a statement at that point, perhaps he already had Moses's judgment. I mean, if he was able to bring Moses back as resurrected, as we see in the Transfiguration, then we have to assume that he was judged originally.
Right. So like,
So to answer your question, I don't have a good answer, but
well, I guess like maybe you could say God like created a temporary body just for Moses and Elijah, just for that moment, so that the disciples could like see that Jesus was really who he said he was, and then maybe after that, God sort of took away those temporary bodies or allowed them to dissipate, whatever they were, so that Moses and Elijah could go back to soul sleep, maybe.
yeah, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Wasn't Elijah one of the ones that God it physically took, anyways? Elijah and Enoch.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Enoch. It says that he was. It's a little bit more up in the
Right,
air,
a
but
vague,
I
but
think there's
Elijah
even like a
was.
tradition with Moses being assumed into heaven as well, or the body after he had died. I think that's
Right.
just a tradition, though.
So
Yeah.
I mean, once again, you could just look at it from that side. Elijah was taken straight up to heaven. So whatever realm we want to consider the spiritual heavenly realm is,
Hmm.
it's very possible that he could have come back with God at that time because he was already there.
That is interesting because I know there is even like some Jewish traditions regarding like seeking intercession from Elijah, even to the point of like setting out a table or
Right.
a place for Elijah for Passover, and even like when Jesus says Eli Eli sabachthani, there's a sort of like, is he calling out for Elijah here? There's a sort of like harkening back to, I guess, a sort of Jewish tradition of like praying in a sense to Elijah, or like asking Elijah to pray for them as well. So like, I guess if Elijah is up in heaven, that would give the Jews of that time a sort of like reasoning behind why it's okay to maybe seek intercession from Elijah.
Right, because we don't see that kind of, intercessory prayer with any other patriarch really. You don't see it with Isaac, you don't really see it with
Mm.
Abraham as much.
Mm.
I mean, Elijah's the only really one that I've ever seen that actually has like a real tradition of intercession.
Mm. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so I remember, like, after Jesus was, I believe, resurrected, or it might have been prior to it, but I remember, like, they said that the saints came out of the ground or something. I remember.
Yeah.
I know Mike Lacona has argued that that was more figurative in order to emphasize just how powerful the resurrection was. That the saints are just coming out at full force. How would you guys make of that sort of thing? Would you guys sort of go with Mike Lacona?
Yeah, I would. I view it if you wanted to view it in the terms of soul sleep. I mean, maybe he was taking those Old Testament saints and bringing them up for judgment at that time. Now that the covenant's been fulfilled, I take that passage as completely, metaphorically or figuratively. I don't think that the saints actually rose up. Who was it? That says that walking zombies
Yeah.
were marching around Jerusalem. I don't hold that view. Mhm.
Yeah, I haven't really looked into it that much. I know it just appears in that one gospel, I think, of Matthew. So yeah, I would like, if I were to try to get a better understanding of it, I would want to like know, okay, what is the traditional reading of this? How has this been understood through the history of Christianity? And then I'd want to sort of like form an opinion from then on. But as of now, I have no real general position on it.
Yeah, so I remember that there is sort of times in the Bible where like the dead seem to come back, where I believe Lazarus.
Mhm.
I know a lot of people would say that that's not a resurrection, that's a resuscitation. Where basically Jesus is merely Lazarus. I think they would say that Lazarus wasn't really so much dead, but he was just sort of like on the verge of death, and Jesus simply brought him back. A sort of resuscitation, like sort of like if John were to have a heart attack right now, and someone was able to call the police in the ambulance to get him, and they shocked him, and he came back.
Yeah,
Yeah,
good luck.
yeah, then that would be sort of a resuscitation. How do you guys make of that sort of thing?
If I recall, I mean, it said that Lazarus was dead for several days at that point, and that's
Right.
the thing. I think that's why I would call it a resurrection in that case, because I mean, I think he was dead for 4 days or 3 days prior or before he arrived. So I mean,
Yeah.
it could be a resuscitation. I mean, maybe they just thought that he was dead, but I mean, it says that he was dead. So I mean, I just take it at face value at that point.
Well, I mean, a thing that typically distinguishes, like I say, resuscitation and a resurrection in the Bible would be the immortal body that you get afterwards in a resurrection. So, and as far as I can tell, Lazarus didn't really get an immortal body. He's just sort of got up and he just sort of lived longer, which is sort of like what a resuscitation would be like.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, but like when Christ was resurrected, he would still have the same body that he had prior to that. It was in a glorified state, sure, but it would still be the same body because that's why the tomb was empty. If he had a new body, then you could still have the full tomb. It's just like, oh, that was his previous body. Now he's got this new one.
Right.
That's true.
So I don't really see much of a difference. I mean, yeah, I kind of get like resuscitation can occur when there's still like at least some activity there in the body. But once it's like dead for like 4 days, then I would say then yeah, that's not something that you can do through a sort of natural
Process.
yeah, exactly. It would have to be
Uh,
something
he was just in a
supernatural.
very deep sleep.
Wake up, Lazarus!
Oh,
Sleepyhead.
I feel like I sleep like that sometimes. My lord.
Yeah, you wake up and find yourself in a tomb with a rock covering it. It's like,
I mean, that would be nice for about a week. You know, catch up on some sleep.
Nice. Yeah. No whining kids or anything like that, I'm sure.
yeah. So, what were I mean, I remember what were some sort of things that you guys wanted to ask each other about, like how you guys both how you guys interact with the Eastern Orthodox sort of stuff, and how you guys where you guys may differ in terms of your own personal beliefs.
Right.
Yeah, I guess I'll just go ahead because like just even though I am Catholic and I think that Catholicism is the one true church that Christ established through Peter, I do find that like the Eastern Orthodox Church has so much continuity with history and is so I don't know the liturgy in the Eastern Orthodox Church is really something remarkable, something that I wish that Catholicism should really borrow a lot from, just because there's so much more. It's so much more, I guess, integrated by being a participant in the liturgy than at least so far I find within Catholicism. Because within Orthodoxy. You're standing, you're kneeling, you're singing, you're chanting. There's like incense and everything is like it's very much engaging you on multiple levels, whereas it is so easy within a lot of the more Western services, I guess, to become almost like a passive recipient to what's going on up there on the altar and on the stage and things like that. And I think that like to be properly a Christian, you have to be actively engaging with the spiritual life. And I think that's something that Eastern Orthodoxy has in spades. And I also really like think that Eastern Orthodoxy's emphasis on the emphasis on building up yourself in your spiritual life is something that I certainly need to integrate more into my own walk as a Christian, and it's something that I think the West certainly seems to sort of lack in putting it as much emphasis. And I don't know. While I've been very much drawn towards Catholicism due to the sort of more systematic approach to theology and a clear understanding of like what is part of church teaching and what isn't part of church teaching. I think that like the sort of open-handedness that Eastern Orthodoxy can have, in that like they're willing to sort of like not care as much about like whether something is a necessary point of their faith or not. I'm sure there's probably a lot of ortho bros online that would like seriously disagree with me, but at least the idea that like there's willingness for mystery, and in fact sort of like a offloading of questions regarding the faith into mysteries, like that's not really important. What you need to worry about is how do you fix yourself, how do you overcome the sin that you sort of allowed into your life. And that's at least what I see as a good emphasis that Eastern Orthodoxy places in very practical sort of sense. Yeah.
So basically clean your room sort of stuff. Fight the dragon.
Yeah, it's kind of. How about you, Frank?
Yeah, and I would agree with that. Here's the issue, and I was thinking about this the other day. I mean, the ritualism is good, that you're right. I mean, the liturgy is just absolutely gorgeous. It's one of the most beautiful things that you could ever participate in. I mean, I tell everybody you need to go to at least one Orthodox liturgy. It doesn't matter if you're a deist, a Christian, a Protestant, a Catholic, an atheist. Everybody just needs to experience it one time, because it is something that's beautiful and eye pleasing, and sometimes that can get in the way. And I think that's where it got for me. I mean, just myself, the beauty of the church started and almost became an idol. I mean, when it engulfs you so much that you just begin to idolize it. That was one of the things that I just had to step back from, to just to grow myself, to learn. I don't need the incense to pray. I don't need these formulations. I mean, the formulations were great. There was always a time and a place in church history where the church had to stand up and say, no, these are the formulations. This is what a Christian is. And that can be found other places. I mean, it's not within just the Catholic Church. It's not within the Orthodox Church. It's within all the churches. I mean, let's be honest. There's a lot of places where each of the churches seem to have gone astray. I know you would disagree with that on the
All
Catholic
but one,
side.
yeah. I'll mostly
Right.
agree with you. No, yeah. There's definitely a lot of places in which the churches went down some bad paths, and there's always opportunity for reform in whatever denomination you find yourself within.
So, are you an Eastern Catholic or are you a Western Catholic?
I wish. Yeah, I don't even know if there's any Eastern Rite churches in my area, really. I just attended boring Novus Ordo, sort of. That's me.
Whenever someone tells me they're a Roman Catholic, I like to ask, where's the Greek Catholics at?
In Greece, obviously.
They would be in the Eastern Rite.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's how since I have a sort of mythology background, whenever I think of like Roman mythology, I think of Greek mythology.
Yeah. All the Roman pantheon of gods, they've just been converted into saints, and all the Greek pantheon, they've been converted.
Yeah. So I was just thinking about like there's this opposite side of Roman Catholic, just that's called the Greek Catholics, that where they have about the same sort of things, but they just have different they just differently.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
it is a little bit like, it's almost like when you attend an Eastern Rite liturgy, it's almost like entering a sort of like twin earth sort of scenario, because like now instead of crossing yourself this way, you'll cross yourself this way. And it's sort of like almost mirrored in a sort of sense. And like there'll be like which direction the priest is facing when he's like blessed. It's a lot of like little weird things, but it's fun.
But it is crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, when you really think about it, it's just like they purposely went opposite of each other
Almost,
just
yeah.
to.
Yeah, like leavened bread, unleavened bread. No. Yeah, it is funny.
so I remember I'm trying to think. Oh yeah. So I think the thing that maybe you both would maybe disagree on is when it comes to the Eucharist, where I know Protestants view it more as symbolic, where Catholics view it as more literal. Is that more or less correct?
I will say it does depend on the Protestants. There are
Yeah.
some, like Lutherans, who would say that there is a real bodily presence of Christ there in the Eucharist, along with the real presence of the bread and the wine there. So it's they hold to a consubstantiation, where you have these two different substances inhering within the same location, I guess. Whereas as Catholics, we're supposed to believe that it is just Christ there, with just the appearance of bread and wine that was there prior. So like God keeps the appearance of bread and wine there for our sake, so that it's not horrifying to observe yourself eating the body and blood of a human person, Christ. But I'm not actually sure what the Methodist position is on this, actually.
Well, and so that's the thing. So, and it just kind of go off of it. Yeah, I mean, even the early Christians had to fend off, um, accusations of cannibalism because
Right.
the pagan world saw that ate the Christians ate their god, and they're like, oh my gosh, these Christians are cannibals.
Yeah.
Well,
No, so
I mean,
I personally take more of that Lutheran view, which is completely compatible with Wesleyan or revival Methodism, of just that, it's coincissant with the
Mhm.
bread and the wine.
Mhm. Would there be a concern then that if you were to show adoration towards Christ in the Eucharist, that you would be simultaneously sort of showing a sort of idolatry towards the elements that are still bread and wine there? So, like, if you were to like direct your love and affection towards Christ, you would also be at the very same time directing your love and affection towards these earthly things. And so, in a sense, you're kind of committing idolatry.
No, and here's why.
Mhm.
So let's say that you went over to like India and you ate at an Indian restaurant that provided a sacrifice of your food before Shiva
Mhm.
before bringing it to your plate.
Mhm.
By eating that meat, you're not breaking, Paul's prohibition on eating meat sacrificed to idols,
Mhm.
because your intent and your knowledge was nowhere near that in idolatry. I think it's the same way if you're showing that adoration to Jesus Christ through the Eucharist, and we'll say, somebody wants to accuse you. I mean, if your intent is not showing
Right.
that bread and the wine itself, the adoration,
Mhm.
God sees the heart. He knows, okay, well, he's not actually worshiping the bread and the wine, he's worshiping my son.
Right.
I mean, God's not going to get confused, be like, ooh, that Methodist prime down there, he's showing honor to bread and wine. Shamey, shamey.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah, that makes
Right.
sense. Do you hold the view that after the Mass has ended that the presence of Christ leaves the Eucharist, such that now they return back to the basic body, the basic bread and wine.
No, I mean, I wouldn't say that it leaves. I mean, God's presence is always there. I mean, I believe, especially within His churches and among His people. I mean, the Spirit of Christ is always there. It's not something that just comes and goes because nobody's there.
Gotcha. Yeah. Because I know, like, at least in some, I think it's Lutheran churches, they'll like return the grape juice back into the bottle and put it in the fridge, and it's like, what are you doing? Like,
Well,
if
I mean,
that's
especially nowadays, have you seen inflation? You got to squeeze out every last drop of grape juice.
Yeah, there you go. Just wringing Christ dry out of the.
Yeah.
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 What was that, Brass?
Oh, no, I was just moving over to get more comfortable.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So, yeah, that is pretty interesting. So, I was wondering how would you guys sort of try to think how to word this correctly. Oh yeah, this is just a little bit of a better question. What Bible translations would you guys say is like ones that you find like the best ones in your opinion? I know since you're a Protestant, obviously it's going to be the King James version of the Bible that you know that you pray to every night before you go to bed.
Amen. No, I actually like the there was a redone version of the Young's Literal Standard Version, just called the Literal Standard Version. It came out 2 years ago, I think. I use that because I mean it does, in my opinion, the best job of translating word for word the Greek to the English. So when I'm studying, especially verb forms and all of that, it's really good to just look in there and be like, okay, so that's, I mean, they maintain the verb forms and everything. So that's one. My like less difficult one to read because the literal standard version can be kind of wordy and weird in places, especially when Paul writes his monologues and his letters, because the Greek is just a lot wordier. But I really like the NASB. I mean, that was for years and years and years my go-to.
Mhm.
The 1995 update. That was the gold standard
Nice.
for Bibles, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So
It's
what about
it's funny you mentioned the King James version, because like I find that like whenever I want to like quote scripture, I always want to quote the King James translation, just because it has a sort of more formal tone to it, and it's so, I don't know, it's something about like the way that the verses are put in that Old English make it sort of more memorable for me. And so like I like prefer, at least when like formally quoting scripture, to use King James. And like I will say, the New King James version is also pretty good. But I don't know. I like I like the Old English. But similar to what you were saying there, Prime, probably my go-to, just in general, for reading, is probably going to be the NASB. It's just sort of more comfortable. But I do say, if I'm going to quote it, I'm going to usually recall it from memory in the sort of King James fashion, which is interesting because like I don't think I read from the King James very much growing up. It's just something about the passages that I do know through memory are always quoted in the King James format. So I'm like, that's how I think of it. So I don't know. It's weird.
So just kind of as a side note, I don't know if either of you have ever heard of this. I don't recommend this Bible translation, but it's pretty funny. It's called the Cotton Patch Bible.
Hmm.
Are you
Hmm.
or the Cotton Patch translation? Have either of you heard of that?
No. Is it like the
S-
Message Bible?
Sort of,
Oh,
except
really?
for worse.
Oh, wow.
So,
Quite a feat.
by what I understand, it started out as a play
Hmm.
that was supposed to be like set in the mid South. Um, that got adapted into a Bible.
Hmm.
So a lot of the epistles of Paul, for example, would be named like First Atlanta 323 or something like that. And they tried to make it with like that old like Atlantean Southern drawl, kind of with the words. I think they gave Joseph, the father of Jesus, the last name Davidson, so they referred to him as Joe Davidson. And for the genealogy, it says that Jesus was born in Athens, Georgia.
Oh boy.
It's a really interesting. I mean, if you just need a good, and I mean, there's good reasons to it. I started reading it more. I'm like, all right, they do pretty good in that part. So I mean, I'm not saying it's a horrible altogether.
Mm-hmm.
It's one that's a good read if you want a good Southern drawl on it.
Yeah.
But just look it up sometime. It's
yeah.
especially that first chapter of Matthew's. Just it'll brighten your day.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. Wow.
What do you guys both think of the? I know you said that you go for a more soul sleep view, but what do you guys both think of the sort of traditional eternal conscious torment view?
I would say that's not the traditional view, but um
Or
I'll
the
just
more view?
that's the more common view, especially among the East or the Western Church today within Protestantism and Catholicism. I'm a conditionalist. I believe in conditional immortality of the soul. So once judgment comes, the wicked's actually, truly burned up or destroyed. That final judgment, that final death, the just kind of poof of out of existence, as Pine Creek likes to say. That kind of thing. Just they burn up.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Yeah. So it's funny, like during my sort of journey regarding Christianity and sort of consideration, I was very open in regards to like what sorts of takes on hell one might hold to. It's funny, I was like, even as almost like a secular theist, maybe you could say, I was sort of inclined to, or I at least appreciated sort of this newer understanding of hell from people like Kierkegaard or even is it no, it's Sartre. Sartre has this play called No Exit, wherein the characters are put in hell and they're just bickering with each other in this like really hot hotel. That's the extent of it. And like in the play, they could leave the hotel at any time. It's just the case that like they enjoy bickering with each other to such a degree and like grating on each other's nerves that that's something that they would be willing to do, I guess, for eternity. That's at least sort of the presumption. And then, and I was always open to C.S. Lewis's. He has a very short book called The Great Divorce, which I think is like excellent. And I think that's kind of like the view that the Eastern Orthodox view, or at least the laity within Eastern Orthodox, the general laity. I think there's probably a small minority, I guess, within Orthodoxy that's also universalist, from following from people like David Bentley Hart. But at least from the Orthodox people that I've interacted with, there's not so much like following in his footsteps. But I'm sure there's a lot of Hartians online that are like that. But having entered into the Catholic tradition, I've felt compelled to try to accept the more traditional understanding of hell, at least insofar as like I'm first entering into the church. I want to fully integrate myself as part of the tradition, and then once that has been established, then maybe I could start to push back in certain areas. And I think that's like, because like, who am I? I'm just some schmuck that entered into the church. There's a lot more that has been going on prior to my entry, so I should probably try to understand the full backstory before I start like changing things all of a sudden. But saying that, I think there's ways in which to understand the eternal conscious torment view in a way that doesn't fully like cause you to turn off your own moral sensibilities at all. So like I think I've articulated this on Dry Apologist channel at some point, but there's a way to sort of think about a someone who has fully rejected God and has no interest or desire to be united with God through charity towards God or towards others, that for them, they might be retained in existence, but not given a temporal experience throughout the whole of time to go forward. So you can sort of think about how there's a difference between, I don't know, the inner experience of a hummingbird and the inner experience of your eye and the inner experience of maybe a tortoise and the inner experience of like a tree, if a tree even has any sorts of experiences. And there's going to be very different sort of like,
That's if you're a panpsychist.
well, I am a panpsychist, but like let's ignore a tree. Let's say snail. Then let's imagine that a snail has some sort of semblance of experience going on for it. That it probably doesn't feel like the time passing as it does for us to a snail, because there's just not going to be that much going on for a snail as it goes through. So like we can think about how God could take the damned. I'm saying damned as if, but like those that have rejected God, and keep them in existence, but not prevent them from experiencing time passing, like in the same sort of way or similar sort of way as to like if I were to reduce Mr. Brass's temporal experiences down to that of a snail, then he could experience a lot more time, but to him would be experienced in a much shorter span. But for the damned, we could say that God shrinks it all the way down to just a single moment of experience stretched out across time. It's not the case that it's like a moment and then another moment and then another moment experienced for them. It's just they're kept having an experience, a single moment of experience extruded across time. And I think that's at least more palatable to our moral sensibilities than to say that, oh yeah, they're tortured in eternity forever, in the sense that it's everlasting, like continually increasing, because there's a general understanding that like no finite crime deserves an infinite amount of punishment. And so I think that's at least one way to sort of technically hold to eternal conscious torment, in the sense that for the person that is has rejected God, their experience is not going to be pleasant. It's just going to be a sort of ultimate reliance upon their own self-existent or their self-acknowledgement, and that when you have rejected the very good itself is not going to be pleasant to like be with yourself, as I'm sure we all can attest to. when we cut ourselves off from God, doesn't feel very good. So and also the understanding that it's eternal in the sense that they're going to continue to exist for the rest of eternity, eternal conscious, and the fact that they're conscious to some extent, without saying that they are experiencing torment in a escalating sort of sense. It's not the case that for the damned, they're continuing. It's going to continue to get worse and worse and worse because there's more moments of time added to their judgment. I think if that were the case, then there's like the certain annihilationist critique in saying that, well, then if that's the case, God's judgment would never be fulfilled, because it's never the case that the damned ever receive their full just punishment, because there's always one more day in which they're still they still require to be punished further. But like, for one, that's understanding eternal conscious torment as a punishment, which I at least wouldn't want to say. I think it would just be more of a natural consequence, I guess, from rejecting God. And also it's something that like preserves the willpower of the agent themselves. It's not the case that God forces everyone to love him, but rather God has that open opportunity set out for everyone. I'm not like a double predestinationist or anything like that, but some people will, and I'm sure sorry, what was I going to say? And some people will reject that opportunity and choose to instead rely upon their own self existence, and then God will sort of keep them in existence for eternity, but won't be giving them this sort of eternal temporal adding it upon of experiences for all of eternity. Sorry for going throughout that, but that's like at least a model of hell that I think is pretty plausible.
So just to get it straight, you both don't read Dante's Inferno like a guidebook.
I mean, maybe it's a guidebook as to like what to avoid. But I actually do need to read that. That's like a strong piece of Western literature that I need to actually better understand.
Oh, have you never read it?
No.
Oh, it's so good. You need to read the entire Divine Comedy. It's
Yeah, I've got them up here on the shelf. It's just yeah, I'll
all
get
three
to
of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. It's definitely worth.
Nice.
It's a good read. It's and just to kind of make John's point a little bit stronger. I mean, I know people like to bring up the objection of the infinite amount of punishments for a finite number of crimes, but
Mhm.
once again, I mean, especially when we look into Christian theology and the biblical text itself, I mean, there's nothing that says that the damned stop sinning after death. I mean,
Mm.
for all we know, Origin took this view. Let me bring out my favorite heretic, Origin, and he had this view is the damned keep sinning, the which he went a little bit further, and he even said that those in heaven, the glorified, can sin and wind up in hell.
But
Or
Origen was a universalist, I thought.
he is. He also
Okay. Oh,
his
that's right, because he also holds to the pre-existence of souls. So
right.
okay,
He's a universalist, but he has a very weird view of it.
I see.
Of
Okay.
of just kind of like this crisscrossing afterlife until eventually, everybody learns, I guess is a good way to put it,
Mhm.
and everybody becomes reconciled. But
Right.
so I mean, just to kind of make that point stronger, that's what I would say is, I mean, there's nothing to assume that those that do go on to eternal conscious torment, that they don't stop sinning. I mean, it's
Mm.
very possible that they continue sinning on into the next life, which makes the soul building theodicy, I mean, even a little bit stronger, because we're
Mm.
in that spiritual formation that we don't sin forever, that eventually, we cast off these sinful chains in the sinful body. We have the glorified, and we all become Christian. But
Right.
that's just a little side note that makes the ECT just slightly stronger.
Yeah, I think Jerry Walls defends that in his view, or in his book. What is that? His book. I think it's like no, I've like hell, the logic of damnation. Yeah, I think he makes that case that like those in hell can continue to blaspheme or continue to do other sins like that, and so that's why there's a possibility for eternal damnation. But I think Jerry Walls opens up the possibility that those that are in hell can still reject their error of their ways and eventually get into heaven, similar to like the way that Lewis seems to lay it out in his book, The Great Divorce.
Yeah. A typical thing that I always like to bring, like that I actually heard another Christian apologist bring up, it's about how if you actually do the mathematics of it, there, when you add up like the amount of punishment over a given amount of time, eventually you reach where they're all equal in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Where, like, he likes to give this example where, let's say you have Hitler and he's in hell, and these are like two alternate timelines. And in one instance of hell, Hitler just gets a slap on his wrist,
Mm-hmm.
and every day after that, it's just like it's that pain of slapping on the wrist for all of eternity.
Mm.
And then in the next one, you get Hitler, but he's like he's being fried like in an oven, and the pain of that goes on for every single day for eternity. Now, we would automatically think that the former would be worse than the latter, but mathematically, if you add up all the pain and suffering over an eternity, they both equal each other.
Would that be right though? Because like even with mathematics, you can have larger and smaller infinities.
Right.
Yeah, but I mean, eventually you would both get into a sort of infinite amount of pain and suffering for either one. So a way that eternal conscious tormentors could say is that God gives a person in hell the just amount for all of eternity. So they get an infinite amount, but it's always the just in quality.
Yeah, and I think probably for most people that that's just not going to fall in line with their moral intuitions at all. That like, no, it's like there's no like level of infinite torture that is just the right amount for whatever sins we might commit in this life.
Right, and I mean, so if I understand you correct, that the amount of the pain and the suffering would be pretty much graded on like a bell curve, almost is what it's sounding like, to where those who I guess weren't as bad as Hitler, for lack of a better term, would
Mhm.
actually receive more pain and suffering because they did less wrong than Hitler.
I mean,
I don't.
overall, it would both them Hitler and the other person would both receive an infinite amount of punishment because when you're extending it that long. But the thing is that qualitatively they're different.
Right. Yeah, and I will say also, like, I have a good friend, dry apologist, who considers himself a semi-annihilationist, where there's the understanding that those that do reject God will receive whatever punishment is just, and then um, basically enter into a sort of like soul sleep sort of state where they continue to exist, but are not like continuing to experience their existence at all. So that's a way in which to remain in line mostly with the tradition of hell without taking that large step of saying that they undergo an infinite amount of conscious torment.
They will have to like what hell will be is they'll have to stay in a hotel room where they're just watching Jersey Shore for the rest of the day.
And then eventually they'll be like, well, I'm done with this. I'm going to turn it off. And then they'll go to sleep. And then that's the rest of eternity for them.
Yeah. So
That's I'm saying that's Caleb, his view. And he is a Catholic. So he's very much committed to like trying to fall in line with the traditional teaching of the church.
so I was wondering, do you guys believe I know the answer from John already, but do you believe that it's okay to call a priest father if he's not actually like your sick biological father?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't bother me, I mean, coming from Orthodoxy, I called priest father. I mean, out of respect, I would still probably, I guess, take my Protestant card here, but I'd still call a Catholic priest father.
Mhm.
Now, I wouldn't call, our pastor father.
Right.
But just out of respect for the priest, I mean, if he'd prefer to be called father, I see nothing wrong with that. I know that people bring up the "don't call any man father" verse in Matthew, but
Yeah.
it's there's bad interpretation all around. So I mean, yeah, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, it's gonna be like the point it seems that Jesus is making there is that like these people that are seeking out sort of like religious accolades from people and like don't buy into they're doing that. Like if somebody's like just wanting to have this sort of superiority over you, don't feed into that for them because that's going to be an opportunity for them to like have ego and all of that. But like if we like Christ is very hyperbolic in a lot of the things that he says. And so like if we were to supposed to like take this one thing that he says and extend it out to like everywhere, it's like it just is gonna come in conflict even with scripture because like Paul considers himself a spiritual father to the people that he goes under, and he'll refer to people as my spiritual child or my children, my sons. It's like, okay, is Paul like going against Christ's teaching here? Or is it's like then you're like pitting Christ against Paul and all that. But I think that like especially given like how ever like intertwined the tradition has been to have a priest and refer to him as father is like okay either Christianity has gone so far off the rails like right off the bat that it's just like what was God doing for all this time, or there's just a non-plausible interpretation of this verse from scripture that Protestants have like taken way out of
Right.
bounds with.
Yeah. So
And that tends to happen. I mean, there's a lot of times where people will they'll get on their for lack of a better term, their anti-Catholic rhetoric, and they'll
Mm.
just we have to go here, which is the polar opposite away from Catholicism. So
Yeah.
I mean, and you'll get a lot of weird twisting with verses just to be obstinate and take the polar opposite view.
And it's
Well,
frustrating too as Catholics because like I think there's much better criticisms of Catholicism than like this one verse here that's like, and then trying to apply that. I don't know. There was some prominent anti-Catholic.
Matt
I don't know
Slick.
if no. Like this is somebody that I like really respected, and then I saw them like tweeting about that. I was like, oh my gosh, man, why? Like of all the low-hanging fruit that you can go with, why are you going with that one? It's just frustrating.
Yeah. So I remember a sort of good measuring stick that I've heard in the Bible about when you're judging Christians and you're judging denominations and disagreements. I know Jesus said, you judge someone by their fruits. How would you guys really interpret that?
I mean, I think Paul lays it out quite clearly in Scripture. The fruits of the Spirit, so to speak. I mean, are what we're actually judging Christians on. The patience, tolerance, long suffering. Slow to anger, that sort of thing. I mean, that's what we're really looking at when we're judging. I mean, if somebody just walks around saying, hey, I believe in Christ, and they're at the strip club smoking cigars and putting dollars into G strings all night. I mean, we have an outward manifestation of what's inward. So we can see that on the inside, that they're at least not showing that they're regenerate. They haven't displayed that aversion to sin that a Christian should, or a new creation, to use the better term, should have.
Yeah, I think that like it's a very good principle that Christ has sort of laid out that like no good fruit can come from a rotten tree. And so I think that like the way that we can understand like these good fruits that are coming from people that there is the Holy Spirit working in them. God's grace has sort of been able to been given to them. And I think like as a Catholic, I think that Vatican II is sort of elaborated the church's teaching on whether God's grace can be found even in religions other than Christianity or the Catholic Church. I think that like God being an all-loving parent for all of creation does want everyone to grow in virtue and so is going to be able to and willing and motivated to offer up grace towards people. And there's sort of an understanding that even secular marriages, there's going to be an opportunity for God to sort of provide grace for the couple there so that they can grow in virtue in order to meet the needs of their children. Similarly, those that are actively willing to do what they believe to be right, God is going to be willing to offer up graces towards them so that they can sort of manifest and live out these good fruit, these supernatural graces of kindness, charity, meekness, all these other graces that are not common. And so, yeah, I think that like some will want to use that verse to sort of like understand the barriers, I guess, of like what counts as a true Christian. And it's just going to be whoever's like whoever's acting Christianly, they're going to be technically a Christian. And I think that's not exactly like the proper way to sort of understand that, because you're going to have a lot of people that are really doing the best they can to be good, and God's going to be working with them so that they can manifest virtue, and so you're going to see good fruits, but that person isn't going to identify with Christian thought and is not going to be an authority in regards to Christian teaching. So I don't think that using this verse as a sort of proof text as to like, oh, well, see, this is what a Christian is. It's just whoever manifests good fruit is going to be sort of, I don't know, an implausible reading by my count as to what really counts as a Christian or what really doesn't count as a Christian.
So I was wondering, Prime, since you're a Christian physicalist, how does that work with your like a view of free will that you might have?
I mean, I think that free will could can arise out of physical processes. I mean, there's nothing saying that we must have a ghost inside of us driving the machine to have free will. I mean, there's actually there's a lot of naturalists that believe in free will as well. I mean, it's not all that common, but they're out there. I mean, just the same way with us. I mean, the free will having free will doesn't necessitate the need to have that external immaterial soul.
Yeah, I'd actually agree. Like, even though, as someone who very publicly defends libertarian free will, I think that, like, if you're a physicalist, even though I find physicalism kind of implausible, at least especially like naturalist physicalism, that yeah, there's nothing that's written in the constraints of physicalism that says that physical objects must behave in a deterministic fashion. In fact, like, there's quite a few very plausible interpretations of quantum mechanics that says that these, I don't know, I guess if you want to qualify like atoms and protons and electrons as physical entities, maybe. But I mean, most physicalists will still admit them into their ontology. So sure, let's say that these things are physical. They behave indeterministically. And so like we can just say, okay, well, the human person is another thing that is wholly physical, but behaves indeterministically. In at least in that regards to free will. I don't know, like some people will like just say that like free will doesn't require the ability to have done this or that. All it requires is acting on the basis of that which you desire to do. I don't find that version of free will very plausible. But I'm just saying that like whichever model of free will you're talking about, both of them are going to be compatible with physicalism.
Yeah.
Even though I don't find physicalism very plausible.
Yeah, I remember, a most common view in philosophy that I have found when it comes to the free will debate is compatibilism. That seems to be like where most philosophers come at. Like, I know most philosophers are also atheists as well, at least from how I read it. So that seems to be popular, and I believe what you were going at is the sort of I can't how to phrase this, like an is implies an ought. I mean, an ought implies a can.
Oh yeah. So yeah, the general argument I make for libertarianism is that if somebody ought to have done otherwise than what they ended up doing, like let's say somebody does something wrong and we say, hey, you shouldn't have done that. You ought to have done what you should have done instead. Then that's going to imply that, yeah, they could have done otherwise than what they ended up doing. And so that's just going to, excuse me, that's just going to basically be what it means to say they had libertarian free will, is the ability to have done otherwise than what they ended up doing. That's the general argument I make, at least for libertarianism.
Have you ever heard of the Frankfurt sort of counterexamples?
Yeah. I think that Frankfurt shows that well, for one, I don't think that's an instance of the person doing something other than what they ought to have done. And if in fact there was this sort of situation, I would say that like that's probably not going to work quite right, because like if it's the case that this man, let's say he cheats on his taxes and that he shouldn't have done that. But if it were the case that he hadn't have done that, there would be this evil scientist that would make it so that he cheated on his taxes. It still seems like he could have done otherwise, but there was this other thing that would have stepped in and changed what he ended up doing. Because like when the evil scientist makes him do this thing, that's not really him as the cause of his actions. It's going to be the evil scientist as the cause of his actions. And so there is this sort of difference between the two situations where one of them is him causing him to cheat on his taxes, and the other one is the evil scientist causing him to cheat on the taxes. So it seems like even on Frankfurt cases that there is this almost alternative possibility. So I'm like not even sure how it's a counterexample to libertarianism, because there is still these two different possible outcomes that might have occurred. One where Jones is the cause of his evil doing, and the other one where the evil scientist is the cause of his evil doing.
Well, I mean, I think often Frankfurt's examples gets up in order to sort of debunk the notion that you would have to have it in order to have moral responsibility. Like, for example, like let's say, for example, that you had this urge where you wanted to kick a puppy,
Mhm.
and that was just an urge that you had that you wanted to do it. But let's say you had some reason that, like, for the day that you said, oh, well, I'm not sure if I'm going to kick a puppy today. And then the scientist just, like, sort of flips a button and then you actually kick the puppy.
Mhm.
In that way, they would still say you're at fault because you still harbored the thoughts of doing it. The fact that you weren't the one that made the decision to kick the puppy doesn't mean that you're entirely not morally guilty, because you still harbored a bad conscience.
Maybe, I guess, but it still wouldn't be the same level of culpability than if you had acted upon that desire to kick the puppy.
Right, and I mean, and I think that's the big thing. I mean, if you're being forced to do X, I mean, in this case, X is kicking the puppy, and you have no other control. I mean, at that point, you want to be, in my opinion, you want to be morally culpable, because I mean,
Right.
once again, even if you had that thought 3 hours before, the thought in itself is not
Mm.
the as culpably wrong as the act of doing it. Your act of doing it wasn't free. In this case, the evil scientist flips a switch in your brain and you kicked a puppy. I mean, at that point, the culpability is still on the scientist that used you as an instrument, that used you as an
Right.
extension of himself.
Yeah. So, I mean, I believe that would also go into coveting, because that would be a bit like how sort of the idea of coveting goes, where because I remember there is some sort of thought where people think that coveting means that you're just desiring something. But that's not what coveting is. Coveting is more like when you actively desire to have the thing that someone else has and you want to take it. Like, it wouldn't be that, let's say, for example, let's say one of John's books or his library. If I said, I want to have a library like that, that wouldn't be coveting. But if I said, for example, oh, I want to have John's library, specifically his, and I'm thinking about taking it, that's coveting.
Mm.
So I think that's how sort of it would go on the Frankfurt example, where, I mean, yeah, you could say that there'd be a different level of culpability, but there would still be some sin involved in it.
I don't know. I would have to think on that a little bit more. I mean, because once again, I still look at it. I just don't know, because I mean, whatever action at that point, I mean, is external to yourself. I mean, the action itself isn't coming from you; it's coming through you.
Right.
So I mean, the going back to the kicking the puppy example. Never thought I'd say those words out loud. Um, the scientist is kicking the puppy through you. You're not actually kicking the puppy yourself.
Even though you may have thought about it before.
Right, even if you thought about
Yeah.
it before. I mean,
yeah, there's going to be a significant difference between thinking about cheating on your wife versus actually cheating on your wife. And sure, you're going to be blameworthy to some extent for like fantasizing about this sort of thing, which is definitely wrong. It's something that you should try to deal with, but it's still going to be very different from actually acting out on those fantasies and actively trying to kick a puppy or cheat on your wife or whatever other sort of problem that we want to bring up here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that is pretty interesting. Trying to think what else is something. Oh yeah, trying to think. So what are some other issues that you guys, like, when you guys were going over your Twitter, like, what were some sort of specifics that you guys wanted to go over with each other?
Well, I don't know. I guess I have two things in mind. I'm assuming that you have no sort of role in your idea of like how the church functions in regards to apostolic succession? Because I think that, at least for me, what I was very inclined towards Eastern Orthodoxy and then later Catholicism was due to the fact that there was this strong continuity with the bishops and heads of the church from the historical foundation. But I'm curious as to like how you understand the way that the church is supposed to function and whether or not there needs to be this sort of like authoritative sort of structure that can like for instance set forward a creed that is binding upon the Christians, uh, as well as like setting forth and resolving some sort of dispute that might be happening within Christianity, say regarding the one or two natures of Christ or Arianism or different things like that. I'm just curious if you think there is a sort of actual authoritative succession that can be had for those within the Christian communities from this sort of like lineage, I guess, being passed down from the apostles and then from there from Christ.
I mean, I think so. I mean, of course, we've got the foundations of Christianity, and I always refer people back to that. I mean, when we're looking at this conversation, I understand that going back to the Great Schism, the Orthodox want to say that the Catholics split, the Catholics say that the Orthodox split. When I mean, truthfully, what we see is just a complete split from each other.
Mhm.
I mean, there at that point there is no longer a straight line through the Christian lineage. But up until that point, we did see a unified church.
Mm.
However thin of a unity that was, but they laid out, that those prime doctrines. We have Arianism that was answered. We had most of Gnosticism that was answered readily by by the earliest church. I mean, at that point, the foundations of what it takes to be a Christian, and of course, I mean, we can have a whole nother conversation on Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, so on and so forth, about whether we can really constitute them within the Christian faith themselves. I mean, that foundation's led. So a lot of the stuff that we talk about, and a lot of the schisms that are happening now, and a lot of the churches that are breaking up are happening over secondary and tertiary issues.
Mm.
I mean, because that foundation's led. I mean, has already been laid.
Mm. So would you say then that like prior to the Great Schism, that there was this sort of like binding authority that the churches had and the bishops within the church, the authority to sort of lay out doctrines and creeds and dogmas of like what is necessary to be a Christian, such as like resolving the controversy of Arianism and the divinity of Christ and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say yeah, but I mean, in that instance, I mean, God instituted what the church needed at the certain time. I mean, we had the apostles who passed on their knowledge, who passed on their knowledge, who passed on their knowledge up until about the time, because I mean, what we have to remember, I mean, most of the laity back during the first, second, third centuries, most of them couldn't read or write. They weren't educated. They weren't taught how to think or how to process or
So,
anything like that. That we see that everybody is at least said to be taught today.
Mhm.
that too.
So I mean, it was a lot more of the high priest or the priestly class was the more educated. As education became more readily available, I feel as if the need for that
I
priesthood
see.
began to recede, because I mean, we're no longer just turning to the lawyers and the doctors to teach us. Everybody's learning how to think, everybody's learning how to pray. I mean, everybody, once the Gutenberg Bible came out, I mean, pretty much everybody had access
Mhm.
to a Bible that they could read. And at that point, that dependence on the priesthood became less and less relevant, in my view.
Right,
So,
gotcha.
so just to get this straight, you're saying that you feel the urge to go to John's church and nail down a treatise on the door.
Listen, I would be more than happy at any point to go to John's Catholic Church and nail, my 99 theses on the door. I would
We
be.
get that from Protestants all the time. Like we have to take them down, throw them in the bin every single Sunday. It's awful.
But I'm going to use Gorilla Glue, so it's on there forever. I'm just going to write a 99 Theses plaque and just put it on there with Gorilla Glue. So.
Wow. Yeah.
What I always find funny about that is I remember that, like, there is a big dramatization that people put in with Martin Luther doing that, and I'm like, that was just typical back then. What made Martin Luther doing that was not so much the fact that he actually did that sort of thing. It was more the fact that the printing press came about, so now it could be copied and more readily distributed. Because a lot of Martin Luther's criticisms of the church had been around before he was born. Like, a criticism that he gave the church was that they were basically giving, like, saying, oh, if you pay, the priests were saying, hey, if you pay me, I'll forgive you of your sins.
Right.
And
that was a common Catholic practice back during Martin Luther's time. I mean, even John will admit the Catholic Church isn't
infallible.
The
Yeah,
church itself isn't infallible.
Right.
The church people aren't infallible. I mean, even the priest can do some pretty bad things, and there was a lot of
there's a lot of
abusive indulgences,
scandals and abuses that have certainly much more than even during the time of Luther that have taken place within the history of the
Right.
Catholic Church. But I think even prior to Luther, that would be considered the sin of simony. I don't know. I've only seen it written, but the sort of understanding that in order to receive the sacraments, you must first pay. That's something that, as far as I'm aware, has already been sort of declared a sin and gone against Catholic canon law to do that. And so, I'm sure that there was plenty of abuses that were taking place during the time of Luther, and it is very appropriate for him to sort of call out the sort of like abuses that he was observing. I just don't think that when you see some sort of abuses taking place within the church that you're a part of, that you should go, well, I'm going to start my own church now. I think that like there's ways in which to sort of resolve these issues from the inside. And in fact, through the Reformation period, there were a lot of I guess they would be like counter reformers, but even those within the church that were trying to reform from the inside. There's Erasmus, I think. Yeah, maybe Erasmus. I think Erasmus was like somebody of that period that was like contending with the reformers, but also still trying to recognize and correct the abuses that were taking place in the Catholic Church during that time.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, and I could find, you could find that complaint being leveled against the church, like, I think up to maybe 100 years before Luther was born. But the thing is that the reason why they didn't become popular is because the printing press hadn't came out. And so it was, Luther was just happened to be in the right time.
Right. Yeah, and I've heard that Luther was more of kind of in that right place and at the right time, and I think in some instances he was, but in a lot of instances, I mean, he codified what the reformers would later branch out of.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, not only did he have these ideas, but he codified them, and I think that was the big difference. I mean, throughout church history, there was all kinds of views on, infant baptism versus non-infant baptism, but it doesn't really become an issue until it becomes codified.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we see with Martin Luther. He took these views, he codified them, and said, "This is the systematic at which my theology reaches," and he laid that out. And we see that through his commentaries, his writings, of him laying out that Protestant reform systematic.
I know a thing that Luther does get a lot of flack for, and now I do see this as a common charge that's leveled against Protestants, is anti-Semitism. Because I remember Luther was sort of, I mean, Luther didn't invent it. It had been around for a while. But Luther sort of more popularized it when I believe he wrote a book or a pamphlet or something, where he just sort of just yelled at Jews for about the entire thing.
Yeah, I think it's like titled "On the Jews and Their Lies" or something like that.
Yeah.
I haven't read it though. But
And I mean, yeah, he was anti-Semitic. I think a lot of Christians, I wouldn't say a lot of Christians at that point were, I think, and I can't answer on that for him. I mean, there could be any number of reasons he felt the way that he did. I know that a lot of people taught that it was more of a common Christian teaching to be anti-Semitic, and I think that's where I would break off from people, because I mean, there's not really a systematic anti-Semitism that's, once again codified out. I think a lot of it was more political angst, more so than the religion itself, because let's be honest, the Jews and the Greeks never really had much of a good relationship. I mean, there was the whole Maccabee Revolution and all of that. Same with the Romans. The Romans didn't particularly care for the Jews either. So as these groups came in and intermixed, I think is where we start seeing a lot of that happening. Is a lot of it's more of that political prejudice more so than the religion itself.
Well,
Because Jews were the first,
Christians. Yeah.
To be honest. So I mean,
Christ himself was a Jew.
It would be weird to say that this religion that came from Jewish people was anti-Semitic. It's not unheard of, but I just, you would have to show me that it wasn't more of a politically motivated thing.
Yeah, well, to me, I think a large part of it was classism, because a lot of the time when you actually look at it, and this was, I believe, something that even some Catholic writers noticed, it was a lot of people were chasing out the rich Jews in the cities. And I think that is part of what it was. It was a matter of classism, where the poor people were just really angry at the rich. And it just so happened that many of the rich people in their towns and villages and whatever just happened to be Jews. And so they leaped on that.
It could, I mean, at that point, we would be trying to psychologize, for lack of a better term, people that we don't really have a frame of reference for. I mean, everything that we know of that time period, we're rebuilding from the scraps that we can find. So, I mean, to say that they didn't like these people because they were rich, the rich just happened to be Jews, therefore the people didn't like the Jews, I think maybe we could deduce that if we interpret everything a certain way, but that's not something that we're really going to be able to answer at this point in time with the knowledge that we have.
That's true too. But so we've been going on for like an hour and a half. So I was thinking, do you guys got any sort of last word you guys want to talk to each other about? Like final topics?
Am I going to hell, John? One of those. I think I get it from all sides, because the Catholics tell me I'm anathemanized, and the Orthodox Church calls me a heretic and a apostate. So,
right.
What is my future hold, John?
Well, so long as you repent and seek confession, I think that God wills for the church to be united, and as of right now, it is certainly disunited. And I do think that, like, in order for it to be reunited, it will be through the Catholic Church. Now, I am under no pretenses that this is going to happen within my lifetime, but hopefully very soon, or as soon as possible. I would love to see that. But yeah, I think that, like, so there's a Latin phrase that is sort of like widely regarded, or part of the Catholic tradition, that I think a lot of modern day Catholics need to wrestle with. Outside the church, there is no salvation. And even like a papal bull, which was like issued at some point, that said that only salvation can only be found in submission to the Roman pontiff. So, like, these are very strong words that are being put forward. And I think that, but I say that even though in Lumen Gentium, there is an explicit, from Vatican II, an explicit recognition that God's plan of salvation extends even beyond the borders of the church, and such that even the unbelievers and the Muslims and the Jews, God has a plan of salvation for them. And so I think that in order to properly understand these two sort of propositions that the church has laid out that are in tension with one another, is to understand maybe at the point at which the church had declared that outside the church there is no salvation, that was them speaking from a sort of point of ignorance regarding, like, just how culpable people are for maybe not accepting the Catholic teachings and submission to Rome, and such that people can, like, we just didn't have the appropriate evidence provided for them as to why they should enter the Catholic Church, and so they, acting on the best evidence that they had available to them, decided to remain Orthodox, or to leave the Catholic Church, or to become Protestant, or something like that. And I think that God certainly recognizes what reasons people have for their actions, and is willing to work with them, even within those reasons. And I think that any sort of broad declaration as to the people that are outside of the church going to hell is just going to be unfounded. And I think that, like, God's going to be working within you and Brass, even, and myself, wherever we're at. Now, hopefully, we'll eventually be able to be reunited with each other in Christ. I mean, we're already united in Christ, given our common baptisms, but there's still a sort of disharmony between our denominations and our churches. So yeah, I think that God does want us to be one as he and the Father are one. And so, yeah, I think that we as Christians should be trying to seek unity while recognizing the points at which we aren't able to yet come into perfect communion with each other. So, yeah, I'm not going to say that you're going to hell at all, Prime. I think that you have, especially given the fact that you are sort of recognizing a sort of tendency within yourself to idolize, or at least get close to idolization of the aesthetic aspects of the divine liturgy within the Eastern Church. I think it is appropriate for you to sort of try to step aside from that and to focus more so on your relationship with Christ alone, rather than these things that might have been getting in the way for you. And so I think, yeah, given where you were at, that's probably an appropriate thing for you to do. And I'll continue to, like, tell you to submit to Rome on Twitter.
Listen,
But,
and I'll issue you the same thing that I issue to everybody. So I mean, pray your rosary hard, because it would take I was just making a joke the other day. It would take a borderline Marian apparition
there you go.
to
Hey,
bring me into
it's been known to happen.
into the Catholic Church. Now,
Yeah.
at that point, I would be more than happy to start looking in that direction. But as
Sure.
it is right now, I've got too much
Right.
baggage.
I got you. Yeah. So I'll be making those calls then to Mary. Tell her that she's got some extra work to be doing. So we'll see how it goes.
If you throw a little bit extra towards towards the priest, I'm
Yeah,
sure that he'll do
I'll try to wet some
he'll do
palms.
his a whole liturgy for me. So
Nice. All right. I'll be sure to work on that then.
All right. Well, this was a
Oh,
good.
sorry, Prime. Did you want to say something as well? I sort of took up that whole last period.
Oh yeah, I mean, was there any one last question that you wanted to ask me? Just that burning question. Pun intended.
Yeah. Why do you hate Christ so much that you're willing to leave his church?
I mean, it's just I love my sin way too much.
Yeah. That's what I
You know,
figured. Yeah.
I love to worship myself, and I'm just one of those horrible, evil people that just can't bow down to Rome. It's
Yeah.
everybody outside of the Western hemisphere just had that issue. It's
Yep. Yeah. Hate to see
So,
it, but
so I would imagine, obviously, you would believe John's going to hell for being a Mary worshiping cannibalistic pagan.
not at all. And I mean, and that's the thing. I have probably a stronger Marian devotion than most Protestants do, given my background. I do. I've seen and read some things that Catholics write, knowing, and I know what they mean. But when I read, I'm just like, wow, you guys are getting just toeing that line.
yeah.
And I know that John's read that too. There's even within Catholics, they all have the same view of Mary. Some are just stronger in their devotion than others, and
Mhm.
that's the thing. So I mean, no, I mean, John, everything that he's shown me, I mean, I know that he's a fellow brother in Christ. I have there's no doubt in my mind that we're at least headed on the same track. So
All right. Well, this has been a great conversation. I've had fun interacting with you two.
oh yeah.
All right. So, thank you everyone who's going to be watching this back once it goes live. And I want to say thank you, John Buck, and thank you, Protestant Prime, for coming on here. Can you tell, first you, John Buck, can you tell the audience where they can find you?
Yeah, I'll be on Twitter at Writer John Buck. I have a YouTube channel, but I don't post anything on there, so don't bother subscribing. Uh, I don't know when this is going to be coming out, but at least this Sunday, the 26th, I will be appearing on Emerson Green's YouTube channel, and I will be debating the filthy atheist on the topic of God's existence. So I'm looking forward to that.
Oh, look
So
at you hitting the big times now.
yeah, big times. But no, I think it's going to be a fun debate because yeah, it specifically sort of targeted my arguments to like address sort of Emerson personally in a sort of sense. But I think it'll be very useful and helpful for people to sort of see how a cumulative case for theism could be done. So I'm looking forward to presenting that this Sunday.
So, where can they find you, Protestant Prime?
All right, so I don't know if I'm going to point correctly, but right there's my name. It's I've changed it to Methodist Prime, being in the Methodist Church now. And the Methodist Church now more than ever it needs a strong voice out there, at least somebody on its side. So yeah, just on Twitter, at Methodist Prime, all one word. I don't post on there as much as I used to, but I'm still fairly active on there every day. So
Mm-hmm. Well, this was a great conversation. So glad to be talking to you. This is Mr. Brass of Brass Discussions saying goodbye and get wise.